What up, Kings? This is the last round of the Pauper tournament our community hosted. If you could tell by the length of the video, we got ourselves quite a game. I'm still doing Moggwarts things. Now today, I'm dueling Ben, who was on Orzhov Blinkblade. This deck looks to abuse artifacts with powerful abilities to either control the board or to accrue value. We both kept our starting 7s, and I'm going first. I play a swamp and cast a chromatic star. I pass the turn. Ben plays a swamp, and then passes the turn. I cast another chromatic star. I play a Drawsforge Bridge for my land and pass the turn. Ben plays an Orzhov Basilica and passes the turn. Since he has more than 7 cards in hand, he discards a Tithing Blade. On my turn, I cast an Ichor Wellspring. When it enters the battlefield, I draw a card. I play a Rakdos Carnarium for my land, bouncing the swamp to my hand. I pass the turn. Ben plays an Ancient Den for the turn. He casts a Thraben Inspector and gets a clue token. He passes the turn. I replay the swamp. I cast a Duress. Ben reveals a swamp, Thorn of the Black Rose, Core Sky Fisher, Tithing Blade, Deadly Dispute, and a Thraben Inspector. I make him discard the Deadly Dispute. I then cast a Skirk Prospector.
It was at this moment he knew. He fucked up.
I wrongfully go for the combo, not properly counting my resources. At this point, I look at my options to figure out how can I remedy the situation I'm in. I begin by sacrificing the star to add a black mana and draw a card. I do it a second time. Realizing I have no options, I'm forced to pass the turn. During my end step, Ben sacrifices his clue token to draw a card. Ben plays a swamp for the turn. Ben casts a Tithing Blade. Because of its Enter the Battlefield ability, I have to sacrifice my Prospector. He then casts a Core Sky Fisher. With its Enter the Battlefield ability, he returns his Tithing Blade to his hand. He attacks for 1, dropping me to 19, and passes the turn. I play a Swamp for the turn. I sit in silence as I think about how everything went wrong for me, and I pass the turn. Ben plays a Thorn of the Black Rose and becomes the Monarch. He attacks me for 3, dropping me to 16. He passes the turn. During his end step, the Monarch triggers and he draws a card. On my turn, I cast a Putrid Goblin. I play another Rakdos Carnarium, bouncing a swamp to my hand. I then cast a second Putrid Goblin and pass the turn. Ben plays a swamp for the turn. He attacks me with all his creatures, dropping me to 12 life. He then casts Olympus. When it enters the battlefield, he scries 1 card to the top and draws a card. He passes the turn. During his end step, he draws a card for being the Monarch. I replay the swamp for the turn. I cast a Goblin Matron. With its Enter the Battlefield ability, I tutor for a Skirk Prospector to my hand. Due to a little distraction, I forget that I tapped my Carnarium and should have 2 additional mana floating. More than likely, this would have had some impact in the game. Unfortunately, I'm only catching this now in post. I cast the Skirk Prospector. I sacrifice both my Putrid Goblins to the Prospector's ability, adding 2 red mana. Their Persist trigger goes on the stack. With the generated mana, I then cast a First Day of Class. In response, Ben casts Suffocating Fumes, giving all of my creatures -1/-1 until end of turn. In response again, I sacrifice my 2 goblins to add 2 red mana to my mana pool. Suffocating Fumes now resolves. My First Day of Class now resolves. And with its Learn ability, I rummage away a Putrid Goblin. The Persist ability now resolves, bringing both of my Putrid Goblins from the graveyard to the battlefield. For some reason, I tap a swamp for nothing and pass the turn. On his turn, Ben attacks with all of his creatures, dropping me to 8 life. He plays a swamp for the turn. He then casts a Goliath Paladin, taking the initiative. He enters the Undercity and goes in the secret entrance, grabbing a Plains to his hand. He then casts a Thraben Inspector. When it enters the battlefield, he gets a clue token. He passes the turn. During his end step, he's supposed to draw from the Monarch, but we miss this. I play a Mountain. I cast a Goblin Matron. When it enters the battlefield, I search for a Skirk Prospector. I then cast a First Day of Class. With its Learn ability, I grab an Introduction to Prophecy from outside the game. I cast the Skirk Prospector. It enters the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter. Now, it's combo time. I demonstrate a loop of sacrificing my Putrid Goblins to my Skirk Prospector to add a red mana. Their Persist ability resolves, returning them to the battlefield. with a -1/-1 counter. But with the first day of class, they enter with a +1/+1 counter, removing all counters from them, which allows me to redo the loop, ending with me having a whole lot of red mana. I then cast an Introduction to Prophecy. With the Prophecy, I was able to find the Goblin Matron. I cast it. Ben knows where this is going and decides to concede the game, and we move to game 2. While we sideboard, indulge me while I go over what went wrong this game. I should have lost, but that is the way of the combo deck. A lucky draw will allow you to get what you need when you need it. This game, I miscalculated my resources, I unknowingly tapped my mana, and go for the combo twice while Ben had all the answers. Whether it's exhaustion or my stupidity, there were a lot of mess-ups that could have been avoided if I just played properly. The magic gods were kind to me, regardless, and allowed me to live and win the game the turn before Ben would have had lethal. Moving on to game 2, Ben goes first. He keeps a 7 while I have to mulligan all the way down to 5. Ben plays a Plains and casts a Relic of Progenitus. He passes the turn. I play a Bojuka Bog targeting Ben. I pass the turn. Ben plays a Swamp and passes the turn. I cast a Duress. Ben reveals 2 cast downs, a Tithing Blade, an Ancient Den, and a Bojuka Bog. I make him discard the Tithing Blade. I play a Great Furnace and cast a Skirk Prospector. I pass the turn. During my end step, Ben casts a cast down on my Prospector and activates the Relic, making me exile a card from my graveyard. On his upkeep, he activates Relic again, making me exile the last card in my graveyard. He plays a Plains and passes the turn. I cast a Braid, choosing to destroy his Relic. In response, he activates his Relic, exiling it and all graveyards to draw a card. I pass the turn. Ben casts a Duress of his own. I reveal Faithless Looting, Unearth, and a Putrid Goblin. He makes me discard the looting. He plays a Bojuka Bog and exiles my graveyard with its Enter the Battlefield ability. He passes the turn. I play a Great Furnace and cast a Putrid Goblin. I pass the turn. Ben plays a Plains. He plays a Thraben Inspector. On his turn, he immediately cracks the Clue token to draw a card. He passes the turn. On my turn, I go to combat and attack with the Goblin. He doesn't block, and he goes down to 18. I play another Great Furnace and pass the turn. Ben plays an Ancient Den. He attacks for 1, dropping me to 19. He passes the turn. I go to combat and attack for 2, dropping him to 16, and I pass the turn. Ben plays a Norzov Basilica. When it enters, he returns his Bojuka Bog to his hand. He then attacks for 1, dropping me to 18, and passes the turn. I attack him for 2, dropping him to 14. I then cast an Ichor Wellspring. When it enters the battlefield, I draw a card. I then pass the turn. Ben plays a Thraben Inspector, and he immediately cracks the Clue token to draw a card. He plays an Ancient Den. He attacks me for 1, dropping me to 17, and passes the turn. I go to combat and attack for 2, dropping him to 12. I play a Swamp and pass the turn. Ben plays a Relic of Progenitus. He passes the turn. Now on my turn, I draw a card and just pass the turn. On Ben's turn, he plays a Tithing Blade. With its Enter the Battlefield ability, I sacrifice the Putrid Goblin. With its Persist trigger on the stack, Ben activates his Relic's ability to exile a card from my graveyard. In response to that effect, I cast First Day of Class. Now on top of that, Ben cracks his Relic to exile all cards and draw a card. That resolves. Now my First Day of Class resolves. With its Learn ability, I reveal Introduction to Prophecy from outside the game. The Persist ability technically resolves, but due to the Relic, it's exiled and doesn't come back. Ben then casts a Deadly Dispute. As its additional cost, he sacrifices a Thraben Inspector. He draws 2 cards and creates a treasure token. He attacks for 1, dropping me to 16. He passes the turn. Now during his end step, I cycle Unearth to draw a card. I play a Vault of Whispers as my land. I then cast a Goblin Matron. With its Enter the Battlefield ability, I tutor for a Skirk Prospector. I then cast an Introduction to Prophecy. I scry 1 to the top and bottom and draw a card and pass the turn. Ben plays an Obscura Hideout. With its Enter the Battlefield ability, he gains life and fetches a swamp to the battlefield tapped. He goes to combat and attacks me for 1, dropping me to 15. On his second main phase, Ben casts a Core Skyfisher. With its Enter the Battlefield trigger, he bounces a Thraben Inspector. He recasts the Thraben Inspector and gets a Clue token. He passes the turn. On my turn, I play a Rakdos Carnarium bouncing the Bazooka Bog. I pass the turn. During my end step, Ben cracks his Clue token to draw a card. Ben plays a Limbus. When it enters, he scries 1 to the bottom and draws a card. He then casts a Deadly Dispute. As an additional cost, he sacrifices his Limbus. When Limbus is put into the graveyard, he shovels it back into his library. Deadly Dispute now resolves, and he draws 2 cards and creates a treasure token. He casts a second Deadly Dispute, and as its additional cost, he sacrifices a treasure token. He draws 2 cards and recreates a treasure token. He then casts a Duress. I reveal a Cast into the Fire, First Day of Class, Future Goblin, and Skirk Prospector, and a Bazooka Bog. He discards the First Day of Class. Ben passes the turn. During cleanup, he discards a Plains to hand size. On my turn, I cast down the Core Skyfisher. I then cast into the fire his Tithing Blade. I play a Bazooka Bog and exile his graveyard, and then I pass the turn. Ben casts a Thorn of the Black Rose, becoming the Monarch. He plays a Bazooka Bog of his own and exiles my graveyard. He passes the turn. On his end step, he draws a card for being the Monarch. On my turn, I cast a Duress. Now in my hand, I currently have enough resources to try to combo once. When I see 4 layers of interaction in his hand with untapped mana, I figured I would try to save time and concede and try to win the next game. This has been a stellar matchup. Both of us are 1-1 this round, and we have played nothing but fun, interesting games of Magic. The only thing stopping one of us from getting the grand prize, which is a Japanese Tempest Lotus Petal, is Game 3. We go to sideboarding and shuffle up our 75. I'm taking to play this game, and we both decide to keep our 7s. On my turn, I play a Bazooka Bog targeting Ben with its ability and pass the turn. Ben plays a Plains and casts a Thraben Inspector. When it enters the battlefield, he creates a Clue token. He passes the turn. I play a Vault of Whispers for the turn and cast an Ichor Wellspring. When it enters, I draw a card. I pass the turn. Ben plays a Swamp for the turn. He then casts a Limbus. When it enters, he scries 1, leaving it on top and draws the card. He attacks me for 1, dropping me to 19, and passes the turn. On my turn, I play another Ichor Wellspring and draw a card. I play a Rakdos Carnarium, bouncing the Vault of Whispers. I pass the turn. Ben plays an Ancient Den. He attacks me for 1, dropping me to 18. He passes the turn. I replay the Vault of Whispers. I pass the turn. Now during my end step, Ben cracks the Clue token to draw a card. Ben plays a Swamp for the turn. He casts a Glinthawk and bounces the Limbus to his hand. He attacks me for 1, dropping me to 17, and passes the turn. I start the turn by casting Duress. Ben reveals 2 Limbus, a Deadly Dispute, Prismatic Strands, Suffocating Fumes, Cast Down, and a Tithing Blade. If I want to win, I just have to slog through all the interaction. I discard the Suffocating Fumes. I play a Mountain for the turn. I then cast a Flame Wave Invoker. I pass the turn. During my end step, Ben plays a Deadly Dispute, sacrificing the Thraben Inspector to draw 2 cards and make a treasure token. Ben casts a Tithing Blade. When it enters, I sacrifice the Invoker. Ben plays a Bazooka Bog, and I exile my graveyard. He then attacks for 2, dropping me to 15. He passes the turn. I play a Swamp for the turn. I cast First Day of Class. In response, he casts Prismatic Strands. When it resolves, he chooses to prevent damage from all red sources. First Day of Class now resolves. With its Learn ability, I grab an Introduction to Prophecy from outside the game. At this point, I shuffled in an extra copy of Introduction to Prophecy from the last game and forgot to take it out. We continue with the game as is. I then cast the Introduction to Prophecy. I top one and bottom the other and draw a card. I pass the turn. Ben plays a Limbus. He scries 1 to the bottom and draws a card. He plays a second Limbus. He scries a card to the top and draws a card. He casts a Relic of Progenitus. He activates the Relic's ability, making me exile a card from my graveyard. He passes the turn. On my turn, I cast a Putrid Goblin. I then cast a second Putrid Goblin and pass the turn. Ben plays a Plains for the turn and casts a Thraben Inspector. When it enters the battlefield, he makes a clue token, which he immediately cracks to draw a card. He activates his Relic and makes me exile a card from my graveyard. He then casts a Glinthawk and bounces his Relic. He recasts the Relic of Progenitus. He then moves to combat, dealing 2 damage to me and dropping me to 13. He passes the turn. Now during his end step, I cast a Braid, choosing to destroy his Relic of Progenitus. In response, he casts a Deadly Dispute and sacrifices the Relic. It resolves and he draws 2 cards and creates a treasure token. On my turn, I go to combat and attack with both of my goblins. Ben takes 4 and drops to 16. In my second main phase, I cast a Makeshift Munitions. I pass the turn. Ben casts a Duress. In response, I cast a First Day of Class. With its learn ability, I rummage away a Skirk Prospector. Duress now resolves, and I reveal a Skirk Prospector and a Deadly Dispute. I discard the dispute. Ben casts a Thraben Inspector and creates another clue token. Ben attacks me for 4. Before we move to damage step, I consider my options and decide to sacrifice a Wellspring to the Makeshift Munitions and deal a damage to the Glinthawk. When it's sent to the graveyard, I draw a card. I do it a second time, this time destroying the Glinthawk and draw my second card. I take 2 damage going down to 11. Ben plays a Swamp and passes the turn. On my turn, I go straight to combat and attack for 4, dropping Ben down to 12. I play a Drawsforge Bridge for my land. I cast a Nicker Wellspring. When it enters the battlefield, I draw a card. I pass the turn. During my end step, Ben cracks both of his Limbus, shuffling them both into his deck and gains 6 life, going back up to 18. Ben plays an Orzhov Basilica, bouncing a Bojuka Bog. He attacks for 2, dropping me to 9 life. He passes the turn. During his end step, I cast Into the Fire, choosing to deal 1 damage to each of his Thraben Inspectors. In response, Ben cracks a clue token to draw a card. Cast Into the Fire resolves. I activate Makeshift Munitions and sacrifice the Wellspring to deal a damage to a Thraben Inspector, killing it. I activate the Makeshift Munitions again, this time sacrificing a Putrid Goblin to deal another damage to the other Inspector. Its persist ability goes on the stack and it comes back to the battlefield with a -1/-1 counter. I kill the other Inspector. On my turn, I cast a Duress. In response, Ben casts a Cast Down, targeting my Putrid Goblin without the -1/-1 counter. Cast Down resolves. Its persist trigger resolves, and now I have 2 goblins with a -1/-1 counter on them. Duress now resolves and Ben reveals 2 Plains and a Bojuka Bog. I attack with the one that isn't summoning sick, dropping Ben down to 17. I then cast a third Putrid Goblin and pass the turn. Ben plays a Bojuka Bog and exiles my graveyard. He crafts his Tithing Blade, transforming it into Consuming Sepulchre by paying its craft cost and exiling a Thraben Inspector from his graveyard. He passes the turn. During his end step, I cast Down, targeting his Glinthawk. In response, he casts down my Putrid Goblin without a -1/-1 counter. That resolves, and now I have 3 goblins with -1/-1 counters on them, and my cast down resolves, killing his Glinthawk. On my turn, I go to combat and attack Ben for 3, dropping him down to 14. I pass the turn. During Ben's upkeep, the Sepulchre triggers, draining me for 1. I go to 8 and he goes to 15. Ben plays a Plains and passes the turn. On my turn, I go to combat and attack Ben for 3, dropping him to 12. Now, it's combo time. I cast a First Day of Class. I choose to not rummage or grab a lesser from outside the game. I cast my 4th Putrid Goblin, and because of First Day of Class, it enters with an additional +1/+1 counter. I then cast a Skirk Prospector. I demonstrate the loop of sacrificing a Putrid Goblin to the Prospector to add a red mana. Ben sees my Makeshift Munitions and knows what's coming next, and he concedes the game. Both of us were 2-0 going into the final round, and I know that this was quite the game. I'm very happy that we both got to show off what our deck was meant to do. I was able to combo from out of nowhere, and Ben was able to highlight his deck and all the intricate synergies that he built into it. The biggest lesson I can say is to take your time and play your game slowly without causing any slow play, of course. In our first round, I made a ton of sloppy plays for whatever reason, due to exhaustion or burnout or whatever. Luckily though, I was still able to sneak the win, but it would have been much earlier and easier if I just took my time and thought about what I was doing. Now, going 3-0 in this tournament was quite an experience and I faced some good matchups. I wasn't able to play the entire field as there were 8 total players, including myself, and we used MTG Companion to take care of matchmaking and scorekeeping. This was, though, quite the experience and I can't wait for the next one. But I'd love to hear from you, Kings. What did you think of the rounds that I put up on YouTube? If we do another tournament, what format would you guys like to see? Let me know in the comments or by liking and subscribing to the channel. You guys can also find me on Instagram, so be sure to connect with me there too. This was a long game and editing this took forever, so it's time for a well-deserved break. Until then, I will see you Kings next time.